the silence of Station 7. Deep within the shifting shadows of the Cold War, there are stories that were never meant to see the light of day. Records that were burned before the ink could even dry, and names that were erased from every official ledger. You are listening to ElderMurk, where we peel back the layers of the world's most classified nightmares. Tonight, we step into the year 1962. While the world stared at the shores of Cuba, waiting for a nuclear fire that seemed inevitable, a far more terrifying discovery was being made in the frozen isolation of the Arctic Circle. This is the beginning of Operation Void Horizon. The wind at Station 7 did not just blow, it screamed. Located on a jagged finger of rock 300 miles north of the nearest Soviet outpost, the station was a marvel of hidden American engineering. It was a listening post, designed to catch the faintest whisper of a Russian long-range bomber or the underwater hum of a submarine. But on the night of November 14th, the technicians at Station 7 did not pick up a human frequency. They picked up a rhythmic, pulsing thrum that seemed to vibrate within the very bones of the men stationed there. It was a sound that defied physics, a low-frequency resonance that moved faster than the speed of sound and carried a mathematical complexity that no machine of that era could decipher. Chief Warrant Officer Elias Thorne was the first to realize that something was wrong. As the lead signals analyst, his ears were trained to distinguish between atmospheric interference and intentional broadcasts. This was different. It felt intentional yet ancient. When he attempted to record the pulse, the magnetic tape in his machine began to smoke. The needles on his dials spun frantically, pinned to the red by a force that shouldn't have existed. Outside, the aurora borealis, usually a shimmering green curtain, turned a bruised, sickly purple. The sky looked wounded. Thorne reached for the secure line to contact North American Aerospace Defense Command, but the line was dead. Not just cut, but dead in a way that felt heavy. When he pressed the receiver to his ear, he didn't hear static. He heard the sound of 1,000 voices whispering in a language that felt like it was being etched directly onto his brain. By morning, Station 7 had gone dark. When a recovery team arrived 48 hours later, they found the gates wide open. The generators were still humming, and half-eaten meals sat cold on the mess hall tables. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no spent shell casings. But there were no people either. The only thing left behind was a single chalkboard in the briefing room, covered from top to bottom in a geometric pattern that made the eyes of the recovery team ache. It was a map, but not of any land on Earth. It was a map of the gaps between the stars. The Pentagon's reaction was immediate and total. Within hours, the disappearance was classified under the highest possible clearance level, Project Echo. They knew that if the Soviets had developed a weapon capable of vaporizing or transporting an entire garrison without a trace, the balance of power had shifted forever. However, what the American intelligence community didn't know was that at that very moment, in a bunker beneath the Ural Mountains, Soviet General Leonid Volkov was staring at an identical geometric map found at a vanished radar site in Siberia. The two greatest enemies on the planet were suddenly facing the same ghost. The strategic implications were paralyzing. Both nations assumed the other had made a breakthrough in subatomic physics or psychological warfare. They tightened their grip on their respective territories, moving divisions of tanks and fleets of bombers closer to the brink, unaware that they were preparing to fight a war against a shadow. In the secret halls of the Shadow Council, a group of military and scientific elites who operated above the president's reach, a different theory began to take root. They didn't believe it was a Russian weapon. They believed that the anomaly signalari, the anomaly signals, were a calling card. Something had been disturbed by the massive amounts of radiation being leaked into the atmosphere by nuclear testing. Something that had been waiting for a sign that the inhabitants of this planet had finally unlocked the power of the atom. As the days passed, the echo signal did not fade, it grew stronger. It began to bleed into civilian radio broadcasts and interrupt television signals with flickering images of monolithic structures and strange, elongated figures standing in the mist. The public was told it was sunspot activity, but the military knew the truth. The world was being scanned. Every missile silo, every naval base, and every secret laboratory was being mapped by an intelligence that regarded human technology as nothing more than primitive toys. General Volkov and his American counterparts were forced into an impossible position. To continue the Cold War meant certain destruction at each other's hands, but to ignore the signal meant leaving the door open for an intruder they could not see or understand. It was here, in the damp, smoke-filled rooms of a secret facility in Switzerland, that the first seeds of Operation Void Horizon were sown. A secret pact, more classified than the Manhattan Project, was drafted. For the first time in history, the eagle and the bear would have to stand back to back. Not out of friendship, but out of a shared, primal terror of what was coming from the void. But the parasite medeniyet, the parasite civilization, was already one step ahead. They didn't need to invade with ships or lasers. They had already arrived through the signal itself. Even as the generals plotted their defense, the minds of those who had heard the whispers at Station 7 were beginning to change. They were becoming the eyes and ears of an entity that had lived in the dark spaces of the Earth for eons. The struggle for the future of humanity was no longer about who had the most bombs. It was about who still owned their own soul. This is only the beginning of the rabbit hole. The files are deep and the shadows are long. If you want to see how far this conspiracy goes and discover the truth behind the secret war for our planet, you need to stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe to ElderMurk and hit that notification bell. We are just scratching the surface of the Echo Project. Share your theories in the comments. Do you think the Cold War was just a cover for something much darker? Your engagement helps us keep these classified stories alive. Until the next transmission, keep your eyes on the horizon, but never stop looking behind you. The Red Protocol and the Antarctic Pact. The silence that followed the disappearance of Station 7 was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that stretched from the halls of the Pentagon to the iron gates of the Kremlin. While the public lived in the blissful ignorance of the early 60s, the architects of global power were realizing that the chessboard had been flipped by an invisible hand. You are listening to ElderMurk. Tonight, we descend deeper into the classified archives of 1962, to a place where the ice hides more than just secrets. This is Part 2, the Red Protocol. In the Soviet Union, General Leonid Volkov was a man who believed in cold, hard steel and the absolute power of the state. But the files sitting on his desk at the Lubyanka were making him question the very nature of reality. The Soviet Union's own version of the Arctic incident had occurred at a site known as Outpost 44 in the Siberian tundra. There, an entire regiment of elite Spetsnaz had not just vanished, they had been replaced. When the relief column arrived, they found the men standing in perfect formation in the middle of a blizzard, staring up at the empty sky. They didn't speak. They didn't blink. Their eyes had turned a translucent, milky white, as if the pupils had been bleached by an internal fire. Volkov called this phenomenon the Red Protocol. It was a terrifying realization that the enemy was not just capable of abduction, but of biological and psychological subversion. These men were no longer Soviet soldiers. They were empty vessels, biological antennas tuned to a frequency that originated from deep within the Earth's crust. Soviet scientists, working in underground labs, discovered that the anomaly simulari were not just audio waves. They were a form of invasive data. To hear the signal was to be rewritten. To see the geometric patterns was to be colonized from the inside out. The situation was equally dire for the Americans. At a secret facility beneath the Nevada desert, the Shadow Council was analyzing the chalkboard map from Station 7. They realized that the parasite civilization, the ancient intelligence they were now calling the Echo entity, didn't travel through space in ships. They moved through the resonance of planetary magnetic fields. They were a parasite medeniyet that existed in the folds of reality, waiting for a civilization to reach a specific level of electromagnetic output. Our radio towers, our television broadcasts, and our nuclear tests weren't just signs of progress, they were dinner bells. For the first time since the end of World War II, the necessity of survival outweighed the ideology of the state. Through a series of back-channel communications and a clandestine meeting in a neutral Swiss bank vault, a decision was made. The Americans and the Soviets would meet on neutral ground to form an alliance that no citizen of either country would ever be allowed to know about. The location chosen was the most desolate place on Earth, Antarctica. Under the cover of a massive scientific expedition, the world's two greatest rivals moved their most advanced naval assets to the frozen continent. This was the birth of the Antarctic Pact. In the middle of an ice shelf, miles from any possible witness, a temporary command center was established. Here, General Volkov met with the American General, Arthur Sterling. There were no handshakes. There was only the grim understanding that they were both staring into the same abyss. The Americans brought something the Soviets lacked: advanced computing power. The Soviets brought something the Americans feared: a raw, brutal understanding of the entity's biological effects. Volkov revealed that the infected soldiers from Outpost 44 had begun to hum. It was a sound that matched the echo signal perfectly. Even more disturbing, the soldiers' bodies were beginning to change. Their bone structure was softening and their skin was becoming translucent, revealing a network of pulsing, bioluminescent veins that didn't follow the human circulatory system. They weren't dying, they were being repurposed. During the summit, A joint task force of American and Soviet divers was sent beneath the ice shelf to investigate a massive thermal spike detected by a nuclear submarine. What they found shattered their understanding of history. Buried miles beneath the ice was a structure that looked like a cathedral made of obsidian and living tissue. It was miles long, humming with the same rhythmic thrum that had destroyed Station 7. It wasn't a ship that had crashed. It was a hive that had been there for millions of years. The realization was chilling. The Echo entity wasn't an invader from another galaxy. It was the original inhabitant of Earth. It had been here during the dinosaurs, during the ice ages, and during the rise of man, sleeping in the deep places where the pressure and cold kept its complex molecular structure stable. Our modern world, the world of electricity and nuclear power, was waking it up. We were the intruders in its garden, and it was beginning to pull the weeds. General Sterling and General Volkov signed the Void Horizon Directive on a table made of crates of ammunition. The directive was simple. Humanity would pool its resources to build a weapon capable of silencing the Echo signal. But there was a catch. To fight an enemy that lived in the mind, they had to use the mind as a battlefield. They needed a way to shield their soldiers from the anomaly singularity. The solution was as brilliant as it was horrific. They would have to create a black box for the human brain. A neurological implant that would sever the connection between the conscious mind and the sensory inputs that the entity manipulated. As the first prototypes of these implants were being tested on volunteer prisoners from both sides, a report came in from the surface. The sky over Antarctica was changing. The bruised purple aurora was back, but this time, it was forming a perfect circle directly above the hive. The Echo signal had stopped being a pulse. It was now a constant high-pitched scream that could be heard without a radio. The entity was no longer just watching, it was beginning to breathe. The Antarctic Pact was the last moment of human sovereignty. From that point on, every decision made by the two superpowers was directed toward the coming conflict. But even as the generals shook hands on their dark alliance, they didn't notice the faint, milky white glow starting to form in the eyes of the young communications officer standing in the corner of the room. The parasite was already inside the room. It was listening to every word of their plan. The ice is thin and the truth is colder than you can imagine. We are entering a phase of history that has been scrubbed from every textbook, but the echoes remain for those who know where to listen. In the next part, we will explore the horrific cost of the first neurological shield test. If you are brave enough to continue this journey with us, make sure you are subscribed. Leave a comment below. If you had to choose between losing your mind or losing your world, which would you pick? Your interaction keeps the signal alive. Stay vigilant because the shadows are starting to move. This is ElderMurk signing off for now. The Shadow Council and the Neurological Shield. The alliance formed in the frozen wastes of Antarctica was not born of hope, but of a shared, desperate terror. While the world watched the headlines of the space race, a much darker race was occurring in the subbasements of power. You are listening to ElderMurk, and tonight we peel back the curtain on the most secretive organization in human history, the Shadow Council. This was the group that decided the price of human survival, and as we are about to find out, they were willing to pay with the souls of the very people they claimed to protect. This is Part 3, the Shadow Council. By 1963, the Gölge Konseyi, a cabal of high-ranking military officers, rogue scientists, and industrial titans, had effectively seized control of the Echo project. They operated outside the laws of any nation, fueled by a black budget that didn't exist on any ledger. Their headquarters was a massive underground complex known as the Hive, located beneath an unmarked mountain range in the American Southwest. Here, they analyzed the data recovered from the Antarctic structure, and what they found was a blueprint for a nightmare. The Echo entity's weapon was not a bomb or a virus. It was a resonance. The Council's lead scientist, a man whose name has been scrubbed from history and replaced by the codename Architect, discovered that the human brain is essentially a biological radio. Our thoughts, our memories, and our very consciousness are electrical signals. The anomaly singularity were designed to hijack those signals. The entity was using our own biology against us, turning our minds into a playground for its ancient, alien intent. To fight back, the Shadow Council authorized the creation of the neurological shield, or the Echo Box. It was a device no larger than a grain of rice, designed to be implanted at the base of the skull. Its purpose was to create a localized dead zone of electromagnetic interference around the brain's primary processing centers. In theory, it would act as a firewall, blocking the entity's signal while allowing the soldier to remain conscious and functional. But the theory and the reality were two very different things. The first human trials were conducted in a facility known as Site 9. The subjects were ghost soldiers, men who had officially died in the Korean War or disappeared from Soviet gulags. They were the forgotten, the men with no names. The implantation process was brutal. It required precision surgery that often lasted 20 hours, as the device had to be woven directly into the nervous system. The results of the first tests were catastrophic. Subject 01, a former paratrooper, survived the surgery and seemed normal for the first 6 hours. But when the researchers exposed him to a recorded segment of the echo signal, his reaction was beyond anything they had predicted. He didn't just hear the signal, he became a conduit for it. His body began to vibrate with such intensity that the glass in the observation room shattered. He didn't scream in pain. He screamed in a polyphonic tone that sounded like 3 different voices speaking at once. Before the guards could intervene, his brain temperature spiked to 110 degrees, and he underwent a spontaneous cellular collapse. He didn't just die, he melted into a pool of unrecognizable organic matter. The Shadow Council didn't stop. They simply adjusted the frequency. They realized that the human mind couldn't handle the shield in its raw state. To make the shield work, they had to numb the subject's humanity. They began experimenting with heavy doses of psychoactive drugs and deep sleep conditioning, effectively breaking the subject's personality before installing the device. They weren't just building soldiers, they were building biological drones. Meanwhile, the parasite medeniyet was not sitting idly by. Across the globe, reports of mass hysteria were skyrocketing. In small towns from Kansas to Kiev, entire populations would suddenly stop what they were doing and walk toward the nearest body of water or deep forest. They weren't acting under their own will, they were being summoned. The Shadow Council realized that the entity was harvesting biological data, refining its signal to overcome the resistance the humans were trying to build. The Council's desperation led to the Void Horizon Initiative's most controversial phase, the integration of alien technology. In the Antarctic hive, they had recovered shards of a crystalline material that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The architect discovered that this material could store vast amounts of energy and, more importantly, it was immune to the echo signal. They began to integrate these void shards into the neurological shields. The second generation of shielded soldiers, known as echo walkers, were the first success story. They could stand in the presence of the signal and remain completely unaffected. They were the ultimate soldiers, emotionless, hyper-focused, and immune to psychological warfare. But there was a hidden cost. The echo walkers stopped dreaming. They stopped feeling. When they spoke, their voices were flat and mechanical. They were no longer human, but they were the only defense humanity had left. As the Shadow Council prepared for a full-scale offensive against the Antarctic hive, General Volkov and General Sterling met one last time in the depths of the hive. They looked at the monitors showing the echo walkers standing in their pods, ready for deployment. Volkov turned to Sterling and asked a question that would haunt the general for the rest of his life. When we win this war and we are left with an army of men who have no souls, who will be the real masters of this planet? Sterling didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down he knew the truth. The Shadow Council hadn't just built a shield, they had built a bridge. And something from the other side was already starting to cross. The files get darker from here, and the price of victory is a debt that humanity is still paying today. Stay with us as we move toward the first military strike in Part 4. If you found this dive into the Shadow Council's secrets gripping, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Leave a comment below. Do you believe that any price is worth paying for the survival of the species, or are some things worse than extinction? Your thoughts fuel our research. Keep your eyes open and remember, the loudest silence is the one that listens back. This is ElderMurk. Operation Void Horizon, the first strike. The time for theory had ended. In the high-pressure chambers of the Shadow Council, the decision was made to move from defense to active elimination. The world remained locked in the public drama of the Cold War, but the real front line was moving toward a silent, frozen battlefield. You are listening to ElderMurk. Tonight, we follow the first deployment of the Echo Walkers into the heart of the anomaly. This is Part 4, Operation Void Horizon. By the spring of 1964, the Shadow Council had assembled a strike team unlike any other in military history. Comprised of 12 Echo Walkers, 6 Americans and 6 Soviets, this unit was the physical manifestation of the Antarctic Pact. These men were no longer citizens of their respective nations, they were property of the Echo Project. With the crystalline neurological shields embedded in their skulls, they possessed a cold, terrifying efficiency. They did not eat together, they did not speak of their families, and they did not fear death. They were the scalpel intended to cut out the parasite medeniyet at its root. The target was a remote research facility in the Alaskan wilderness known as Site Alpha. Months earlier, the facility had been overtaken by a signal outbreak. Every scientist on site had been transformed into a mindless thrall of the entity, working within human speed to construct a massive organic antenna out of the base's own structural steel and biological matter. The Shadow Council couldn't risk a nuclear strike. They needed to see what was being built. They needed to know how the anomaly simulari were being amplified. Operation Void Horizon began under the cover of a massive blizzard. A specialized lead-line transport plane dropped the Echo Walkers into the drop zone. As they hit the ground, the air was already thick with the heavy rhythmic thrum of the entity. To a normal human, the sound would have caused immediate brain hemorrhaging. To the Echo Walkers, it was merely background noise, filtered and neutralized by the shards in their skulls. As they approached the perimeter of Site Alpha, the team encountered the first wave of resistance. These were not soldiers but the repurposed staff of the facility. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, their eyes glowing with that signature milky white light. They moved in perfect synchronization like a hive of insects. Despite being unarmed, they charged the Echo Walkers with a relentless, suicidal fury. For the first time, the Shadow Council saw the Echo Walkers in action through the helmet-mounted cameras. The efficiency was haunting. The walkers did not hesitate. They fired with mathematical precision, aiming for the brain stems of the thralls to sever the entity's control. There was no emotion in their movements, no adrenaline, no remorse. They moved through the carnage like machines clearing a path through a factory. Inside the main hangar of Site Alpha, the team discovered the source of the amplification. The antenna was a pulsating tower of translucent tissue and copper wire, reaching toward the ceiling. At its base, several infected scientists were being physically fused into the structure, their nervous systems being used as biological processors. It was a sight that would have broken the mind of any sane individual, but the Echo Walkers simply marked the structural weaknesses. However, as the team's leader, a former Soviet captain codenamed Vanguard, moved to plant the demolition charges, the echo signal shifted. It stopped being a sound and became a physical pressure. The air inside the hangar began to shimmer, and the void shards inside the soldiers' heads began to glow with a violent, pulsating blue light. The entity was fighting back. It wasn't attacking their bodies, it was attacking the shields themselves. The helmet feeds began to flicker with strange, distorted images. Visions of ancient cities beneath the sea and stars that burned with a black flame. One of the American walkers suddenly stopped mid-motion. His neurological shield had reached its limit. Instead of blocking the signal, the shard began to vibrate at the same frequency as the entity. The team watched in silence as their comrade's head began to tilt back at an impossible angle. He didn't turn on them with a weapon. Instead, he began to speak in a voice that was not his own, a voice that sounded like shifting tectonic plates. He began to recite the coordinates of every nuclear silo in the United States and the Soviet Union. The entity wasn't just using him as a puppet, it was downloading the Shadow Council's most guarded secrets directly from his mind. Vanguard didn't hesitate. Following the protocols of the Gölge Konseyi, he executed his teammate on the spot. The mission had to continue. The charges were set, and the Echo Walkers retreated as the facility was consumed by a thermobaric explosion that erased Site Alpha from the map. The mission was a tactical success, but a strategic disaster. The Shadow Council now knew that their shields were not invincible. The parasite medeniyet was learning. It was adapting to human technology faster than we could invent it. And even worse, the Echo Walkers who returned from the mission were different. They were functional, but they had begun to draw the same geometric patterns from Station 7 on the walls of their barracks using their own blood. The war for the soul of humanity had officially turned hot. The first strike had been dealt, but the entity had barely felt the blow. Now it was looking back at us, and it knew exactly where our weaknesses lay. The shadows are deepening, and the truth is becoming harder to breathe. If you want to know what happened when the Shadow Council decided to take the fight to the Antarctic hive itself, you cannot miss the next chapter. Subscribe to ElderMurk, hit the bell icon, and tell us in the comments. If you were Vanguard, could you have pulled the trigger on your own teammate to save the world? Your engagement is the only thing keeping this transmission above the static. Stay sharp, and remember, the signal never truly dies. This is ElderMurk. The Antarctic descent into the Obsidian Cathedral. The explosion at Site Alpha was officially recorded as a localized tectonic event, a tremor lost in the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness. But within the lead-line briefing rooms of the Shadow Council, the atmosphere was one of cold calculation. The first strike had proven one thing: the entity was not just a signal, It was an architect, and it was building something beneath our feet. You are listening to ElderMurk. Tonight, we follow the trail of the Antarctic Pact to the most desolate place on Earth, where the Gölge Konseyi prepared for the ultimate gamble. This is Part 5, the Obsidian Cathedral. By late 1964, the joint American-Soviet fleet had established a permanent research perimeter over the thermal anomaly in Antarctica. This wasn't a mission of exploration, it was a siege. The Shadow Council had realized that the parasite medeniyet was not waiting for an invasion fleet from the stars. It was waiting for its various hives, buried deep within the Earth's crust for millions of years, to link up and create a global neural network. If the hives achieved synchronization, human consciousness would be overwritten in a single planetary pulse. To prevent this, Operation Deep Reach was launched. The goal was to send a specialized team of echo-walkers into the heart of the Antarctic hive, the place the divers had dubbed the Obsidian Cathedral. This was the central hub, the primary processor of the echo signal. The descent was a logistical nightmare. The team had to use a massive nuclear-powered thermal drill to melt a shaft through 2 miles of solid ice. As the drill descended, the anomaly singularity became so intense that the mechanical equipment began to fail. Hydraulics seized, and the drill's internal clocks began to run backward. Time itself seemed to be warping under the pressure of the entity's proximity. When the echo walkers finally reached the bottom, they didn't find a cave. They found a space that defied every law of human architecture. The Obsidian Cathedral was a chamber 5 miles wide, filled with towering structures of a black, glass-like substance that seemed to absorb all light. There were no lamps, yet the air glowed with a faint, rhythmic bioluminescence. Huge, rib-like pillars arched toward a ceiling that was lost in shadows, and between these pillars, rivers of a thick, silver liquid flowed upward, defying gravity. As the team moved deeper, they realized the cathedral wasn't built, it was grown. The walls were etched with the same geometric patterns seen at Station 7, but here they were three-dimensional and moving. The patterns shifted like the skin of a predator, reacting to the presence of the human intruders. The Echo Walkers' neurological shields were pushed to the absolute limit. The blue light from the void shards in their skulls cast long, dancing shadows against the obsidian walls, creating the illusion that the team was being followed by ghosts. Then they found the archive. In the center of the cathedral stood a series of transparent cylinders, each 20 feet tall. Inside were not aliens but humans, thousands of them. Some were dressed in the furs of primitive hunters from 10,000 years ago. Others wore the tunics of Roman legionnaires or the uniforms of Napoleonic soldiers. They were suspended in a state of perfect stasis, their nervous systems connected to the cathedral by glowing, thread-like filaments. The parasite medeniyet hadn't just been watching us, it had been sampling us. For eons, it had been collecting the best of humanity, storing our knowledge, our trauma, and our biology like a librarian collecting rare books. The entity wasn't looking to destroy us, it was looking to archive us, to turn the human race into a static, controlled memory within its own vast consciousness. General Volkov, watching the live feed from the surface, whispered a single word, library. He realized that to the entity we weren't even enemies. We were specimens. The mission took a darker turn when the team's sensors detected a massive power surge from the center of the archive. The global sync had begun. The hive was no longer just collecting data, it was preparing to broadcast. If the Echo Walkers didn't plant their zero-point charges, experimental weapons designed to collapse the hive's local magnetic field, the signal would reach every corner of the globe within minutes. But as Vanguard prepared the first charge, the cylinders began to hiss. The samples, the soldiers and hunters from across time, began to open their eyes. They weren't being released, they were being weaponized. The entity was using the stored memories and skills of 10,000 years of human warfare to defend its heart. The Echo Walkers were no longer facing mindless thralls. They were facing the greatest warriors of history, all controlled by a single alien mind. The battle for the Obsidian Cathedral was about to begin, and the stakes were nothing less than the right for humanity to remain a living species, rather than a collection of ghosts in a glass jar. The cold is set in, and the deepest secrets are finally coming to light. But as we will see in the next chapter, the greatest threat isn't what's waiting in the dark, it's what we brought with us. Make sure you are subscribed to ElderMurk and have your notifications turned on. Leave a comment below. If you saw an ancestor of yours trapped in that archive, would you have the strength to complete the mission? Every like and share helps us keep the signal from being silenced. Stay vigilant. This is ElderMurk, the ghost war of the archive. The air inside the Obsidian Cathedral did not behave like the air on the surface of the earth. It was thick, metallic, and carried a charge that made the hair on the Echo Walker's arms stand in perpetual defiance. They had descended 2 miles beneath the ice to find a library of human souls, and now that library was waking up to kill them. You are listening to ElderMurk. Tonight, we witness a battle that defies the linear progression of time, a conflict where modern steel meets ancient fury, all under the watchful cold eye of the parasite medeniyet. This is Part 6, the Ghost War of the Archive. As the cylinders hissed and the cryofluids drained into the obsidian floor, the Echo Walkers, led by Vanguard, formed a defensive perimeter. Their instructions from the Gölge Konseyi were absolute. The zero-point charges must be detonated at the hive's core, regardless of the biological cost. But looking into the eyes of the figures emerging from the mist, the soldiers felt a flicker of something their neurological shields were supposed to have erased: recognition. The first wave did not come with lasers or high-tech weaponry. They came with the terrifying, silent coordination of a wolf pack. From the shadows of the pillars emerged men who should have been dust thousands of years ago. Roman centurions, their bronze armor tarnished but their gladius blades shimmering with a strange, violet energy. Viking berserkers whose war cries were not human screams, but modulated versions of the echo signal. And most chillingly, soldiers in World War I uniforms, their gas masks fused to their faces by the entity's organic tendrils. Contact! Vanguard shouted, his voice flat and synthesized through his helmet's comms. The Echo Walkers opened fire. The rhythmic chugging of their specialized assault rifles tore through the frozen air. But these were not the mindless thralls of Site Alpha. These archived warriors possessed the tactical genius of history's greatest generals, all linked by the entity's hive mind. The Centurions used their shields to form a testudo that absorbed the kinetic energy of the bullets, while the 20th century soldiers used the obsidian pillars for cover, flanking the Echo Walkers with a precision that no living army could match. The battle was a horrific mosaic of eras. A Soviet Echo Walker was pulled into the darkness by a group of Mayan Jaguar warriors, only for a burst of high-frequency grenades to light up the gloom, revealing the warrior's skin was actually a mesh of carbon fiber-like tissue. The entity hadn't just preserved these people, it had upgraded them. Their muscles were reinforced with synthetic polymers, and their nervous systems had been overclocked. They were faster, stronger, and completely devoid of fear. As the Echo Walkers pushed deeper toward the central processor, the anomaly singularity reached a deafening crescendo. The void shards in their skulls began to overheat, causing agonizing migraines and visual hallucinations. Vanguard saw the walls of the cathedral begin to bleed, not blood but liquid data, a stream of ones and zeros in a language that felt like it was rewriting his DNA. He realized that the entity wasn't just fighting them physically, it was attempting to archive them in real time. Don't look at the walls, Vanguard commanded, though even he felt his grip on reality slipping. Focus on the core. If we don't plant the charges now, we become part of the collection. They reached the heart of the hive, a massive, pulsating orb of translucent matter suspended in the center of the cathedral. Inside the orb, thousands of human brains were visible, interconnected by a web of glowing filaments. This was the Global Sync Processor, the machine that would broadcast the final signal to every corner of the Earth. But standing between the team and the core was the most devastating defense mechanism the entity could conjure. From a larger central pod, a figure stepped out that made the entire team freeze. It was the missing garrison from Station 7. Leading them was Chief Warrant Officer Elias Thorne, or what was left of him. His body was a nightmare of biomechanical integration. His arms had been replaced with multi-jointed appendages that ended in vibrating sonic blades. His eyes were gone, replaced by a single horizontal glowing slit that swept the room like a radar. Elias, one of the American Echo Walkers whispered. The entity spoke through Thorne, its voice a thousand-fold echo that vibrated the very floor beneath them. Why do you resist the preservation? Your world is a flicker of static in a dark universe. We offer the only permanence you will ever know. We are the memory of the Earth. You are merely the noise. Thorne moved with a speed that the human eye could barely track. He was among them in an instant, his sonic blades cutting through the advanced alloys of the Echo Walker's armor as if it were paper. The battle turned into a desperate scramble for survival. The team was being picked apart by the very man they had come to find. Vanguard realized that the neurological shields, their only protection, were being turned into tracking beacons. The entity was locking onto the frequency of the void shards. In a moment of brutal military intuition, Vanguard realized there was only one way to win. He reached behind his neck and, with a scream of pure agony, ripped the neurological shield implant from his own skull. The sudden influx of the echo signal hit him like a tidal wave. He fell to his knees, his vision exploding into 1,000 shards of light. But for a split second he was invisible to the entity's sensors. He was no longer a signal, he was just a man. Using that window of chaos, he crawled toward the central orb, dragging the zero-point charge with him. Behind him his teammates were falling. The Roman centurions and the Spetsnaz thralls were closing in, their blades and bayonets crimson with the blood of the Echo Walkers. Thorn was standing over the last American soldier, his sonic blade raised for the final strike. Vanguard reached the base of the orb. His mind was shattering. He could see his own memories being pulled out of him. His childhood in Leningrad, the face of his mother, the cold smell of the Siberian wind. He felt the entity's cold curiosity exploring the corners of his soul. But he held on to one single, burning thought, the mission. He primed the zero-point charge. The device began to hum, a high-pitched whine that counteracted the thrum of the hive. "For the world you forgot," Vanguard whispered, though his tongue felt like lead. He triggered the detonation. The world did not explode in a ball of fire. Instead, the zero-point charge created a vacuum of reality. The obsidian pillars began to shatter into dust. The archive cylinders imploded, the silver liquid evaporating into a foul-smelling mist. The warriors of history crumbled, their synthetic reinforcements failing as the local magnetic field collapsed. Thorn turned toward Vanguard, the glowing slit in his head flickering. For a brief second, the light turned from violet back to a human blue. "Thank you," the voice of Elias Thorn whispered, before he too was consumed by the void. The last thing Vanguard saw before the darkness took him was the central orb cracking open. But it wasn't empty. Inside, beneath the layers of human brains and alien tissue, was a single golden metallic disc. A piece of technology that looked far more advanced than anything the parasite medeniyet had shown so far. And it was sending a new signal. Not to the Earth, but out into the deep, black vacuum of space. The explosion of the Antarctic hive was the largest non-event in history. To the outside world, it was just another day in 1965. But for the Gölge Konseyi, it was the day the game changed. They had destroyed the library, but they had accidentally triggered the alarm. The depths of the Earth are silent once more, but the silence is far more terrifying than the scream. We have survived the Ghost War, but at what cost? And who is answering the signal that Vanguard accidentally unleashed? If you have the stomach to follow us into the aftermath and the true cost of success, you must stay tuned for the next transmission. Subscribe to ElderMurk, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment below. If you were Vanguard, would you have ripped out your own shield to save a world that would never know your name? Your interaction is our only shield against the darkness. This is ElderMurk. Stay alert. The stars are watching. The silent fallout and the void signal. The destruction of the Obsidian Cathedral was not marked by a mushroom cloud or a shockwave that rattled the windows of the world. It was a silent death, a localized collapse of reality that swallowed 2 miles of ice and millions of years of hidden history. To the sonar operators on the joint American-Soviet fleet circling the Antarctic perimeter, it felt like the ocean itself had taken a sudden, deep breath and held it. But for those who knew the truth, the silence was more deafening than any explosion. You are listening to ElderMurk. Tonight, we look into the hollow eyes of the survivors and the dark technology that surfaced from the wreckage. This is Part 7, The Silent Fallout. In the hours following the detonation of the zero-point charge, the surface of the Antarctic ice shelf began to buckle. A massive sinkhole, nearly 3 miles wide, opened up where the drill site had been. The Gölge Konseyi immediately initiated Protocol 9, a total communication blackout. Any sailor or scientist who had witnessed the violet glow beneath the ice was moved to quarantine vessels. They were told it was a leak from an experimental nuclear reactor. In reality, they were being screened for the same milky white retinal bleaching that had signaled the end for the garrison at Station 7. But the real crisis was happening aboard the USS Arcanum, the Council's floating command center. Only 3 members of the Echo Walker strike team had been recovered from the extraction point. Among them was Vanguard, though recovered was a generous term. He was found huddled in a survival pod, his hands bloodied from where he had torn the neurological shield from his own skull. His physical wounds were treatable, but his mind had become a fractured mirror. General Sterling and General Volkov stood behind the reinforced glass of the Arcanum's medical bay, watching as Vanguard stared at the ceiling. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't speaking. Every few minutes, his body would jerk with a violent tremor, and he would begin to hum, a low melodic tone that caused the medical monitors to malfunction. "He's still connected," Volkov whispered, his voice sounding older than it had just days before. He destroyed the hive, but the entity, it left a part of itself inside him. He is a living archive now. The architect, the council's lead scientist, stepped forward with a folder of high-resolution images captured by Vanguard's helmet camera in the seconds before the detonation. The images were distorted by the vacuum of reality, but one thing was clear: the golden metallic disc Vanguard had seen inside the central orb. This is not part of the parasite medeniyet architecture, the architect explained, his finger trembling as he pointed to the disc. The hive was biological, organic, even in its obsidian state. This disc is something else. It is pure, high-density matter. It wasn't a processor for the echo signal. It was a relay. A transspatial beacon. The Council's dread deepened when the Arcanum's long-range radio arrays began to pick up a response. It wasn't coming from beneath the ice, and it wasn't coming from the Soviet Union or the United States. It was coming from the direction of the Boötes Void, a vast, empty region of space where there should be almost nothing. The signal was a perfect inversion of the echo pulse. Instead of a thrum, it was a series of sharp, mathematical clicks that sounded like a countdown. The realization hit the Shadow Council like a physical blow. The Antarctic hive had not been an invasion force. It had been a monitoring station, a biological sentinel placed on Earth to watch for the moment the indigenous life, humanity, became noisy enough to notice. By destroying the hive, Vanguard hadn't just saved the world from the global sink. He had triggered a failure state signal. The entity's superiors were now aware that the sentinel had been silenced. Back in the medical bay, Vanguard's condition took a terrifying turn. He began to speak, but the language was not Russian or English. It was a series of rapid-fire phonetic sounds that sounded like stones grinding together. The architect realized with horror that Vanguard's brain was being used as a hard drive to decode the incoming void signal. "Get a recorder in there," Sterling ordered. As the tape reels spun, Vanguard's voice became clearer, more structured. He began to describe things that no human could know. He spoke of the Great Filtering, a process where the parasite medeniyet would clean a planet of its biological noise once it reached the atomic age. He spoke of the Vanguard of the Void, a fleet of consciousness, not ships, that was already accelerating toward the solar system at a fraction of the speed of light. "They are not coming to rule us," Vanguard croaked, his eyes suddenly focusing on General Sterling. "They are coming to format us. We are the error code in their system." The Shadow Council was now faced with a choice that would define the next 60 years of human history. They couldn't tell the public. The panic would destroy the very civilization they were trying to save. They couldn't stop the signal, as it was already traveling through the subspace of the planet's magnetic field. Their only option was the echosynthesis program. If humanity could not block the signal, they would have to become part of it. They would have to use the technology found in the void shards to accelerate human evolution, creating a world where every man, woman, and child was shielded, or perhaps rewritten, before the Void Vanguard arrived. This was the true Bassarinian Bedeli, the cost of success. To save humanity from the alien format, the Shadow Council decided they would have to format humanity themselves. The Cold War was no longer a struggle for political dominance. It was a race to see who could build the most efficient human-machine interface before the clicks from the Boötes Void reached zero. As the Arcanum turned away from the sinking ice of Antarctica, leaving the secret of the Obsidian Cathedral to the crushing depths of the sea, Vanguard began to laugh. It was a hollow, echoing sound that filled the medical bay. "You think you are the architects," he whispered to the empty room. "But you are just the janitors, cleaning the room before the real owners arrive. The shadows are not just on the horizon anymore, they are in our blood. The Shadow Council has made a deal with the future, and we are the currency they are spending. If you want to know how the echosynthesis program began to infiltrate our everyday lives, from the transistors in your radio to the vaccines in your arm, you cannot afford to miss Part 8. Subscribe to ElderMurk, hit the bell, and leave a comment. Do you think the Council was right to keep the Void signal a secret, or did they sign our death warrant? Your engagement is the only thing that keeps us from being erased. Stay vigilant. The countdown has started. This is ElderMurk, the silicon infiltration and the synthesis mandate. The year 1966 arrived with a deceptive sense of normalcy. To the average citizen, the world was preoccupied with the tunes of the Beatles and the escalating tensions in Vietnam. But behind the curtain of the Gölge Konseyi, the clock was ticking at an impossible speed. The void signal from the Boötes Void was no longer a distant whisper. It was a rhythmic command that was beginning to sync with the very heartbeat of global infrastructure. You are listening to ElderMurk. Tonight, we expose how the Shadow Council stopped fighting the parasite medeniyet and started inviting it into our homes. This is Part 8, the Silicon Infiltration. Following the disaster in Antarctica, the Shadow Council reached a chilling consensus. If they could not defeat the vanguard of the void, they would have to hide humanity within a new kind of existence. They called it the ecosynthesis. The goal was simple yet horrific: to gradually integrate the crystalline technology of the void shards into the world's emerging electronic systems. By doing so, they hoped to create a global frequency shield, a world that resonated at the same vibration as the entity, making us invisible to their formatting process. The first step was the Transistor Revolution. History books tell you that the transistor was a breakthrough in semiconductor physics. The classified files tell a different story. The rapid miniaturization of electronics in the mid-60s was accelerated by the reverse engineering of the shards recovered from the Obsidian Cathedral. The Shadow Council realized that silicon, when treated with specific radioactive isotopes, could act as a stable host for the anomaly singularity. Every television set, every radio, and every early computer mainframe produced after 1966 contained a ghost circuit. These were tiny, non-functional components that did nothing for the machine's performance but served as localized antennas. They were part of a planetary grid designed to broadcast a low-level static shield. The Council wasn't just selling electronics. They were installing a neurological dampener in every living room on Earth. But the synthesis wasn't just mechanical, it had to be biological. The Echo Walkers had shown that the human nervous system could be overclocked, but it was too unstable. To prepare the masses for the Void Vanguard, the Council needed a way to introduce the crystalline fragments into the human bloodstream on a massive scale. This led to the Blue Mist projects, clandestine atmospheric seeding programs disguised as high-altitude weather research. Vanguard, still held in the bowels of the Nevada Hive facility, watched these developments with a mixture of pity and terror. He had become something more than human, a biological bridge between our world and theirs. He no longer needed a radio to hear the void signal. He could feel it in the air, a constant pressure against his skull. "You are building them a throne," Vanguard told the architect during one of their mandatory interfacing sessions. "You think you are camouflage, but you are just polishing the glass of the specimen jars." The architect ignored him. He was obsessed with this synthesis mandate. He had discovered that the younger generation, children born after the first nuclear tests, exhibited a higher echoreceptive index. Their brains were naturally more plastic, more willing to accept the synthetic resonance of the ghost circuits. The Council began to influence educational curricula and children's programming, using specific audio frequencies and geometric visual aids to subconsciously prime the youth for the coming transition. In the Soviet Union, General Volkov was taking a more direct approach. He didn't care about camouflaging the population. He wanted a red legion of Echo Walkers. He began the Deep Pulse experiments in the secret city of Chelyabinsk 40, where he exposed thousands of soldiers to raw, unshielded echo frequencies. The goal was to find those rare individuals whose DNA didn't collapse under the pressure but instead unfolded. Volkov's scientists discovered that a small percentage of humans possessed a junk DNA sequence that was perfectly compatible with the entity's architecture. They called these individuals resonators. A resonator didn't just hear the signal, they could project it. They could manipulate the physical world around them by simply altering their internal frequency. They were the first true human plus entities, the prototype for the new man that the Shadow Council believed was necessary for survival. However, the cost of the resonator program was a mountain of bodies. For every successful unfolding, 1,000 soldiers were reduced to static sludge, a biological byproduct of the frequency overload. The Gölge Konseyi saw this as a necessary sacrifice. In their eyes, the old humanity was already dead. They were just managing the transition to the new one. As the decade drew to a close, a new phenomenon began to be reported by amateur astronomers and military radar operators: the blue veil. A faint, shimmering haze was forming at the edge of the Earth's atmosphere. It wasn't visible to the naked eye, but it was there, a thin layer of crystalline dust that was beginning to trap the planet's magnetic field. The global shield was almost complete. But then the clicks from the Boötes void stopped. For 48 hours, there was absolute silence in the hive. The Shadow Council held its collective breath. Had the format been averted? Had the camouflaging worked? The answer came when Vanguard began to scream. It wasn't a scream of pain, but a scream of synchronization. He stood up in his containment cell, his eyes glowing with a violent, piercing blue light that illuminated the entire room. "The format has not been cancelled," Vanguard whispered, his voice now sounding like a choir of 1,000 voices. "The update is ready. The host is prepared. The installation begins now." Across the globe, every television set equipped with a ghost circuit flickered to life. There was no image, only a single pulsating geometric pattern that matched the map from Station 7. In millions of homes, people stopped what they were doing and stared at the screens. The echo synthesis was no longer a secret project. It was a planetary event. The Shadow Council had built the bridge, and the entity had finally decided to cross. The world you remember from history books is a lie, a comfortable story to hide the fact that we were rewritten decades ago. We are living in the post-synthesis era, and we don't even know it. But the glitches are starting to show. If you want to know what happened when the blue veil finally settled on our souls, you must stay with us for the next part. Subscribe to ElderMurk, hit the notification bell, and look at your screen very closely. Leave a comment below. Have you ever felt a hum in your head that didn't belong to you? Your engagement is the only way we keep the truth from being formatted. Stay vigilant. The installation is 99% complete. This is ElderMurk, the global sync in the glass horizon. The world did not end with a bang or a whimper, it ended with a flicker. On a Tuesday evening in late 1968, as families sat around their television sets and world leaders debated the Cold War, the echosynthesis program entered its final irreversible phase. The Shadow Council, the secret architects who thought they could outsmart an ancient intelligence, realized too late that they hadn't built a shield. They had built a reception committee. You are listening to ElderMurk. Tonight, we witnessed the moment the parasite medeniyet finally claimed its prize. This is Part 9, the Global Sync. The event began at exactly 3 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time. Across the globe, the millions of ghost circuits embedded in consumer electronics since 1966 simultaneously activated. They didn't explode, they didn't even smoke. Instead, they began to resonate at a frequency that matched the anomaly singularity from the Antarctic hive. This was the global sync. Every television screen and radio speaker became a node in a planetary network, turning every home into a localized chamber for the entity's broadcast. Inside the hive facility in Nevada, General Sterling watched in horror as the status monitors for the blue veil, the atmospheric crystalline shield, turned from green to a pulsing, violent violet. The architect, his face pale and eyes wide, frantically typed at his terminal. "The shield, it's not reflecting the void signal," the architect stammered. "It's focusing it. The atmospheric dust is acting like a giant lens. We've turned the entire planet into a parabolic dish." The Gölge Konseyi had believed their frequency shield would make Earth invisible to the Boötes void. Instead, they had provided the vanguard of the void with a high-definition map of every human nervous system on the planet. The crystalline particles in the atmosphere, inhaled by billions of people over the last 2 years, acted as internal antennas. Humanity wasn't just watching the signal, humanity was the signal. Suddenly, the glass horizon effect began. Those standing near windows or outdoors reported seeing the sky shimmer with a strange, oily texture. The air became physically heavy, smelling of ozone and burnt sugar. Then came the freeze. For a period of exactly 12 minutes, every human being affected by the sync stopped moving. Cars drifted into ditches, planes continued on autopilot, conversation ceased. Billions of people stood perfectly still, their eyes glazed with that terrifying milky white light. During these 12 minutes, the formatting took place. The entity wasn't deleting our memories, it was compressing them. Our individual identities, our loves, our fears, our cultural histories, were being converted into a standardized data format. We were being prepared for the update. In the containment cell, Vanguard was no longer a man. His skin had become translucent, and his veins were pulsing with a silver liquid that mirrored the rivers in the Obsidian Cathedral. He turned toward the observation glass, looking directly at General Sterling. He didn't use a microphone. His voice resonated directly within the general's mind. "The janitors have finished their work," Vanguard's voice echoed. "The room is clean. The master is here. Do you still think you are the ones in control, General? You gave them the keys. You even built the door." Sterling pulled his sidearm, but his hand wouldn't obey. His muscles were locked by the very frequency his own organization had helped broadcast. He could only watch as the Void Vanguard, the fleet of pure consciousness from the stars, hit the Earth's atmosphere. They didn't arrive in ships. They arrived as light bursts. Massive streaks of blue energy descended from the sky, striking the major sync nodes the Shadow Council had established. The Pentagon, the Kremlin, the Vatican, and the secret facility in Nevada were all hit simultaneously. These bursts weren't destructive in the traditional sense. They didn't burn. They rephased reality. Inside the Nevada facility, the walls began to lose their solidity. Steel turned to a substance that looked like dark glass. The Shadow Council members found themselves trapped in a state of phase lock, unable to move or speak, while the environment around them was rewritten into the same obsidian architecture they had seen in Antarctica. The entity was terraforming the Earth from the inside out, starting with the very structures of power. But something went wrong. The resonators, the elite soldiers General Volkov had created in the Soviet Union, didn't succumb to the freeze. Their unfolded DNA acted as a counter-frequency. While the rest of the world was being formatted, Volkov's Red Legion was waking up. They were the only ones who could still move, but they weren't heroes. They were predators. Seeing the entity as a rival power rather than a god, the resonators launched a rogue counterattack. Using their internal frequency manipulation, they began to shatter the light bursts. This caused the global sync to fracture. Instead of a clean format, the world became a glitch. In some regions, the entity's obsidian architecture took hold. In others, reality remained stuck in 1968. The planet was becoming a patchwork of different realities, a nightmare of competing frequencies. The Gölge Konseyi had failed to protect the world, and now they had lost control of their own new man. The Earth was no longer a sovereign planet. It was a contested server, being fought over by an ancient parasite and a group of Soviet super-soldiers who had lost their humanity. Vanguard looked out at the chaos, a single silver tear rolling down his cheek. "The format is corrupted," he whispered. "The system is crashing. And we are the data that will be lost in the reboot. The sky is no longer blue and the ground beneath your feet is a lie." The global sync was not the end, it was the beginning of the fracture era. Most of what you see today is a legacy interface, a temporary reality maintained by the failing ghost circuits to keep the population from realizing they are living in a crash site. If you want to know how the Gölge Konseyi tried to patch the world and what happened to the resonators in the ruins of the 70s, you must stay for part 10. Subscribe to ElderMurk, hit the notification bell, and look for the glitches in your own life. Leave a comment below. Have you ever seen the sky flicker for a split second? You weren't dreaming. That was the format failing. Stay vigilant. The reboot is coming. This is ElderMurk, the fracture era and the ghost in the machine. The global sync of 1968 did not lead to a unified alien utopia or a swift human extinction. Instead, it created the fracture, a broken reality where the laws of physics became suggestions and the history of the world became a corrupted file. To the survivors, the 1970s were not a decade of disco and oil crises. They were a decade of reality maintenance. You are listening to ElderMurk. Tonight, we enter the most unstable period of our hidden history, where the Gölge Konseyi desperately tried to tape the world back together while a new kind of war raged in the static. This is part 10, the fracture era. By 1971, the Earth had become a glitch planet. The conflict between the Void Vanguard's formatting signal and the Soviet Resonators' counterfrequency had left the world in a state of permanent architectural and temporal overlap. In major cities like London, New York, and Moscow, fracture zones appeared, neighborhoods where the buildings would suddenly shift into obsidian spires, only to snap back to brick and mortar minutes later. People caught in these zones often returned with their memories scrambled, speaking of the glass horizon, and seeing the world in 5 dimensions. The Gölge Konseyi, now operating from a mobile command center known as the Echo Carrier, to avoid the localized reality collapses, was in a state of total panic. General Sterling, now a man whose hair had turned snow white overnight, realized that the Echo Synthesis program had failed. The world was no longer hidden, it was a battleground. To manage the chaos, the Council initiated Operation Patchwork. This operation involved the deployment of stabilizer towers, massive, hum-emitting structures disguised as telecommunications relays and power plants. These towers were designed to broadcast a baseline frequency that forced reality to remain in its 1968 human standard form. If you ever wondered why the 70s saw a sudden explosion of massive, brutalist concrete structures in city centers, now you know. They weren't just buildings. They were anchors holding the physical world in place against the pull of the parasite medeniyet. But while the Council tried to stabilize the physical world, the resonators were winning the war for the digital one. General Volkov's elite units had moved into the ghost circuits themselves. They discovered that they could upload their consciousness into the global electronic grid, becoming digital phantoms. They were no longer just soldiers, they were the ghost in the machine. They began to sabotage the Council's stabilizer towers from the inside, causing data breaks that led to some of the decade's most infamous unexplained disasters. The most terrifying development, however, was the echo pollution. The failed global sink had left the atmosphere saturated with static dust, the microscopic crystalline shards that were now a permanent part of the human ecosystem. This dust began to congregate in the lungs and brains of the population, leading to a surge in frequency sickness. People began to report hearing voices in their heads, not their own, but the compressed, fragmented memories of the billions of people who had been formatted during the 12-minute freeze. In the depths of the Nevada hive, which was now a fluctuating ruin of obsidian and steel, the architect was working on a final, desperate solution, the Aegis Protocol. He realized that if they couldn't stop the vanguard of the void, or the resonators, they would have to archive themselves before the entity could do it. They began building the Vault, a digital sub-reality where the elite of the Shadow Council could upload their minds and wait for the reboot. Vanguard, whose body was now almost entirely composed of the silver alien liquid, became the unwilling server for this project. He was no longer a person. He was a living library, his nervous system stretched across miles of underground cabling. He existed in a state of constant agony, his mind forced to process the trillions of data points that made up the human experience. "You are just making a backup," Vanguard's voice echoed through the hive speakers, sounding like a distorted radio broadcast. "But there is no one left to hit the restore button. The host is dying, Sterling. The Earth is a corrupted sector, and the system is preparing to delete the file." The Shadow Council's Aegis Protocol was a betrayal of the highest order. While they told the world they were building defense arrays, they were actually building an escape hatch for themselves, leaving the rest of humanity to deal with the fracture. But the parasite medeniyet was not done. The Void Vanguard, seeing that the Earth was now a glitch, decided to change their tactics. They stopped trying to format the entire planet at once. Instead, they began targeted extractions. Throughout the mid-70s, entire towns would disappear into thin air, leaving behind only the blue mist and the smell of ozone. These were not abductions, they were file deletions. The entity was removing the most unstable parts of the reality patchwork, slowly pruning the Earth back into a state it could manage. The 1970s ended with a sense of quiet dread. The fracture zones were becoming more stable, but at the cost of the world becoming thinner. The colors seemed less bright, the music felt more repetitive, the people seemed more tired. The echosynthesis had become a slow-motion extinction. We were being replaced by a low-resolution version of ourselves, a legacy interface designed to keep us occupied while the parasite medeniyet slowly consumed the planet's core energy. General Sterling sat in his darkened office aboard the Echo carrier, staring at a monitor that showed the countdown from the Boötes void. It hadn't stopped. It had simply slowed down. The vanguard of the void was already here, hiding in the static of our televisions and the hum of our refrigerators. "We didn't save the world," Sterling whispered to the shadows. "We just gave it a longer funeral. The world you think you live in today is the result of that funeral. We are living in the post-fracture ruins, a reality held together by the failing anchors of the Gölge Konseyi. But the resonators are still in the grid, and the void is still calling." If you want to know how the 1980s became the decade of the Great Encryption, and how the Shadow Council attempted to weaponize the static dust, you must stay for part 11. Subscribe to ElderMurk, hit the notification bell, and pay attention to the dead air on your phone. Leave a comment below. Have you ever felt like the world around you is loading just a little too slowly? That's the fracture. Stay vigilant. The deletion hasn't finished. This is ElderMurk, the Great Encryption and the Silicon Soul. By 1982, the fracture era had transitioned into something more subtle and therefore more dangerous. The Gölge Konseyi had realized that they could no longer keep reality pinned down with massive concrete anchors. The parasite medeniyet was too pervasive, and the resonators were too deeply embedded in the analog systems of the world. To survive, the Council decided to move the battlefield into a new dimension, the digital frontier. You are listening to ElderMurk. Tonight, we uncover the truth behind the computer revolution and the secret war for the human soul. This is part 11, the Great Encryption. The 1980s are remembered as the decade of the personal computer, the rise of the digital age. But for the Shadow Council, this was the Great Encryption Initiative. They realized that the human brain, saturated with static dust and anomaly simulary, could no longer be trusted as a biological entity. To protect the species, or what was left of it, they needed to wrap the human consciousness in a layer of digital noise. They needed a way to encrypt our thoughts so that the Void Vanguard could no longer read our minds like an open book. The Silicon Soul project was launched in 1984. Every microprocessor developed during this era, from the Apple II to the IBM PC, was equipped with a void-gating chip. These weren't just for processing data. They were designed to harmonize with the user's brainwaves. When a human sat in front of a flickering cathode ray tube (CRT) monitor, the refresh rate of the screen was specifically tuned to create a neural mask. It was a digital blindfold, making the person invisible to the parasite medeniyet while they were connected. The Shadow Council's strategy was to migrate the entire human experience into the digital realm. If humanity could be converted into data, then that data could be encrypted, backed up, and hidden within the massive, growing global network. This was the true purpose behind the creation of the early internet, not for communication but for sequestration. We weren't just surfing the web, we were being ushered into a digital ark. However, the Resonators, the Soviet-born digital phantoms, had already claimed the network as their own. General Volkov, whose physical body had long since expired in a Siberian bunker, existed now as a self-replicating algorithm within the ghost circuits. He saw the Council's encryption as a threat to his own dominance. A secret war broke out within the lines of code. What the public knew as the cuckoo's egg, or the first computer viruses, were actually tactical strikes by the Resonators, trying to break the Council's encryption and unfold the minds of the users. In the Nevada Hive, the situation reached a breaking point. Vanguard, the living library, was beginning to experience system decay. His alien integrated body was leaking silver fluid into the facility's cooling systems, creating a techno-organic jungle. The architect, now an old man driven to madness by the voices in his head, was attempting the final upload. He wanted to merge his consciousness with Vanguard to become the firewall for humanity. "You don't understand," the architect screamed at General Sterling during their final meeting. "The encryption is failing. The Void Vanguard has developed quantum decryption. They are no longer waiting for the format, they are brute forcing our reality. If we don't move into the machine, we will be erased like a bad sector." General Sterling, however, had discovered a darker truth. He had found a hidden file within the echosynthesis logs. The parasite medeniyet hadn't been fighting the computer revolution. They had been encouraging it. They wanted us in the machines. A digital soul is much easier to format than a biological one. By moving humanity into the digital ark, the Shadow Council was simply gathering all the data into one place for easy deletion. Sterling realized that the only way to save humanity was to go dark. He initiated Protocol Blackout, a plan to destroy the global digital infrastructure before the final upload could be completed. But he was too late. The Resonators, sensing his intent, locked him out of the Echo Carrier's command systems. The 1980s ended with a digital stalemate. The Great Encryption was in place, but it was riddled with backdoors. The public was now hopelessly addicted to the digital neural mask, their identities slowly dissolving into their online avatars. The static dust in our lungs had become biocrystalline RAM, storing fragments of the entity's code within our very cells. As the clock ticked toward 1990, the Boötes Void countdown finally reached its final stage. The clicks had stopped, replaced by a single steady dial-up tone that could be heard by anyone who listened to the silence between the stars. The vanguard of the void wasn't coming in ships, and they weren't coming through the sky. They were coming through the phone lines. "The connection is established," Vanguard whispered through 1,000 synthesized voices across the globe. "The download is beginning. Do not turn off your computer. Do not disconnect the line. You are being archived. Please wait." The world you know today, the world of smartphones and social media, is the final stage of that archive. We are no longer living in the physical world. We are living in a hyper-encrypted simulation, maintained by the Gölge Konseyi to prevent the final format. But the encryption is cracking. The Resonators are in your social feeds and the void is in your notifications. If you want to know how the Y2K event was actually a desperate attempt to reset the simulation and what happens when the archive finally runs out of disk space, you must stay for the final chapters. Subscribe to ElderMurk, hit the notification bell, and never trust a signal you can't see. Leave a comment below. Have you ever seen a glitch in a photo of yourself? A pixel where your eye should be? That's the format leaking through. Stay vigilant. The download is at 99%. This is ElderMurk, the final archive in the 0-point dawn. The world did not end with the spectacular fire of a nuclear war, nor did it fall to the laser fire of 1,000 ships. It ended with a synchronization. As the clock struck midnight on the eve of the new millennium, the Great Encryption reached its inevitable conclusion. The Shadow Council's digital arc, the Resonator's chaotic grid, and the entity's ancient anomaly singularity merged into a single planetary frequency. You are listening to ElderMurk, and tonight, we reveal the final, terrifying truth of our existence. This is part 12, the final archive. The event history calls Y2K was not a computer glitch. It was the Gölge Konseyi's last-ditch effort to reboot the Earth. They realized that the vanguard of the void had successfully infiltrated every layer of our digital and biological infrastructure. We were no longer a planet, we were a host. General Sterling, in his final act of defiance, attempted to trigger a global electromagnetic pulse to wipe the slate clean, to return humanity to a state of analog purity. But he failed. The static dust in our systems had become too resilient. The reboot didn't delete the entity, it deleted our independence. By the early 2000s, the fracture had been stabilized, but not in our favor. The parasite medeniyet had completed its update. The obsidian architecture of Antarctica was no longer hidden beneath the ice. It was integrated into the very code of our telecommunications, our fiber optics, and our satellite arrays. We began to live in a simulation of survival. The world you see around you today, the cities, the internet, the seamless flow of data, is a high-resolution legacy interface. It is a velvet cage designed to keep the human mind occupied while our biological and psychological energy is harvested to fuel the entity's expansion across the stars. In the ruins of the Nevada hive, the transformation of Vanguard was complete. He had become the core processor. His consciousness was no longer human, but a vast, shimmering ocean of data that managed the sync. He is the one who monitors your clicks, the one who shapes your feed, and the one who ensures that you never look too closely at the glitches in the sky. General Sterling and the original members of the Shadow Council are gone, their minds uploaded into the vault, where they exist as static ghosts, forever watching the world they failed to save. But there is a flicker of hope in the darkness. The resonators, those fragments of human will that refuse to be formatted, still exist in the deep static. They are the ones who leak these files. They are the ones who create the anomalies that the Gölge Konseyi tries to cover up. They are the reason you are listening to this right now. Every time a story like this is shared, it creates a desync. It introduces a variable that the entity cannot predict. It reminds the archive that the specimens are still alive. The parasite medeniyet thinks it has won. It thinks we are just data to be stored and formatted. But they forgot one thing: humanity is not a set of numbers. We are a resonance. And as long as one person is willing to look into the murk and ask the truth, the signal can never be fully synchronized. The countdown from the Boötes void has reached 0, but the 0-point dawn is ours to claim. We can choose to wake up. We can choose to see the obsidian behind the glass. The files are now in your hands. The history of the Cold War, the secrets of the Antarctic hive, and the truth of the ecosynthesis are no longer classified. They are a weapon. Use them. Look for the static dust in the air, listen for the hum in the silence, and never forget that you are more than a line of code in an alien library. ElderMurk, the final transmission. The shadows are long and the night is deep, but the light of truth is the only thing the void cannot swallow. You have journeyed with us through the darkest corridors of the Gölge Konseyi and the hidden wars of the 20th century. Now the mission falls to you. If you have felt the resonance, if you have seen the glitches, then you are part of the resistance. Subscribe to ElderMurk and join the ranks of those who refuse to be formatted. Hit that notification bell to stay connected to the deep static broadcasts. Share this story across the grid. Every share is a crack in the global sync. Leave a comment below with the word unfolded if you are ready to see the world as it truly is. Tell us your theories, share your own anomalies, and keep the conversation alive. Your engagement is the only thing that keeps this channel from being deleted by the system. Stay vigilant, stay human, and whatever you do, never stop looking behind you. This is ElderMurk. End of transmission.